My guest today has spent decades mastering the art of audio storytelling and effective communication, and he's a New York City media veteran. Trust me, when I say and I tell you the accolades, you'll realize why. Was a renowned producer at Scott and Todd in the Morning, 95.5 WPLJ in New York. He's used that wisdom into his best-selling book, Good Listen, and now leads the podcasting charge as director of podcasts for Advantage Media and Forbes Books, helping others create content that deeply resonates. Joe Pardavila is with me, and thanks for being on with me, Joe.
Oh, you're very welcome. This is going to be odd for me, I will tell you, because usually I'm on the question-asking end of things, so it's always weird when I'm on the receiving end. So bear with me during this, because I'm used to being the captain. So it almost feels like I'm not Captain Phillips. Like now you're the captain. So I'm just going to have to just ride your coattails and see how this goes.
Well, I'll try to produce this best I can. Now, it was 2009 that you joined with ABC Radio, or was Cumulus Media at the time?
It was actually Disney.
Oh, that's right.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So WPLJ was for many, many years owned by Capital Cities ABC. Right. And then during the merger of ABC and Disney took on all those radio stations. And then that was Michael Eisner's dream. Michael Eisner loved being involved with radio and TV. And then Robert Iger took over. He said, what are we doing in the radio business? We got to get rid of these things. We're a theme park and a movie and a television company. We're not a radio station company.
Well, see, they were wrong about that, because ABC for so many years, going from the 70s into the 80s, or even the 60s, let's just talk about WABC before all this came around. Yeah. They ran great radio stations. They actually had really good, great radio programming. Even syndicated was really well done. And from there, you come in and what was the role you had at Scott and Todd initially? Was it producing already, or was it, tell me what was initially the direction, and what was your hierarchy from the time you were there up until the end?
Yeah, so I was going to college at William Patterson College in New Jersey, a fine state school. But I was one of these kids that I always wanted to get into media. But my parents were immigrants. We didn't have any connections or know anybody. Yeah. So while I was going to school, I said, I don't even know if I'm going to like this radio thing. I mean, I know I was a fan of it, but can I make a career out of it? So I applied to WPLJ for an internship and I don't know, for whatever reason, I didn't realize I had this much self-awareness as a young person, but I was like, most people don't get internships till much later in their college years. Like they wait till maybe their senior year, but I was doing it as a sophomore. So I go for my spring semester and I intern at WPLJ, and it was fun. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And as people may know, if they get their foot in the radio door, essentially you start in promotions, driving around van, handing out T-shirts, all that kind of things. So I did that for the span of the semester. The summer break comes and the promotion department says, hey, listen, we're in a bind. We have to fill a position for one of our full-time promotion coordinators. Would you be willing to leave school and join the company? I'm like, hell yeah. I'm not a fan of school. Let me go do it. So in the meantime, as I'm working in promotions, I'm doing a lot of emceeing. I'm doing a lot of public facing stuff for the radio station. And lo and behold, I didn't realize the host of the morning show noticed who I was. Like they would see me hosting events. So it was at the time it was Scott Shannon and Todd.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So Scott Shannon, obviously
let's go take away. Let's talk about Scott Shannon. All right. So yeah. I know from the fact I did watch the Z100 Worst to First documentary.
Yep.
And I'm very well familiar with what he did in Tampa and what he's able to go and do there, making his way to New York. Because what a sea change for him to go into that climate and do what he tried to do. And then also being very ambitious when it comes to going to Los Angeles, trying to go ahead and replicate the same, coming back to New York. And now what he does with the Oldies channel and just it's consistently been prominent in the space. So for him to go and tap into you gotta, let's put it all together. You're interning in the number one market. You're not even going to okay, you're in New Jersey. You could have gone to a lower market and worked your way up. You went right to number one. I don't know if you were paying attention to that when you did that. And Scott Shannon catches your eye. Tell me about the fact of what was the initial reaction when you got to work with Scott Shannon and when he started talking to you about he saw your potential, bringing you on board to his morning show.
Yeah. So what happened was, you got the chronological order perfectly. So he started in Florida, or actually he kind of started in smaller stations, but he broke out in Tampa.
Yeah, and then, Q105, right.
In the early 80s, Top 40 radio in New York was dead. People take it for granted now that D100's here, and then there were several other hot AC, Top 40 stations there. But in the early 80s, there was no top 40 radio in New York. It was basically like rock and like derivations of any kind of urban, just everything but pop music. So he came in and essentially took the city by storm. You mentioned the documentary that was released a few years ago about taking the station worst first, and it literally was the worst station on the planet. They brought him to just raise it from the dead. And because of him tapping into that need and also the timing of it, because remember, this is early 80s. This is like Michael Jackson, Madonna, Cyndi Lauper, Bruce Springsteen. This is when all these pop acts are blowing up. So it was the perfect time in the perfect city to launch this station. And they, lo and behold, went first from worst to first in a matter of months. And it was a sensation. Like, there are stories of people like driving around New York City with their windows down, looking at each other like, oh, you're listening to Z100? Yeah, I'm listening to Z100. Yeah. And so it was huge. So at the time, the station's taken off, and then Scott's like, you know what? What's my worth? So he goes to the boss of Z100 like, hey, give me more money or I'm going to go see what's out there.
Right.
And he wants to see if he could replicate that model. Goes to LA. It doesn't work out. He's told me this story several times, but a lot of it was just like bad ownership. Really just they put too much money up front. So they were losing money. So the station went kaput. And PLJ at the time was sort of one of these middling New York City radio stations. Everyone kind of knew it from its rock and roll days and such, but it was still just one of those things, stations that was always playing catch up to Z100. So they brought on Scott. Scott then brought on a partner, Todd Pettengill, he was his morning show host for 20 plus years, and sort of the rest is history with Scott. So meanwhile, I'm like this young intern, and what's funny too is I would have a lot of conversation with Scott where he would be like, "Hey, you remember when I used to do this Z100?" I'm like, "Nope, I was too young." Like I was like when he was at Z100, I was like maybe like 7 or 8 or 9. Like, so I was like really young, and I was never like a Scott Shannon fanboy. I knew the name, obviously. Like, if you lived in the New York City area, everyone knew who Scott Shannon was, which is kind of crazy to think now in this world of radio. But yeah, so he would always say like, "Do you remember this moment?" I'm like, nope, never had it. But I've always had a huge respect for him. So when they brought me on, they were looking to sort of like freshen up the show because the show had kind of inherited older producers from the previous morning show. So they wanted some fresh voices, some really more like younger energy. And my start was essentially as a phone op. For many people, like, that transition is usually working in promotions as an intern and then going to become the phone op is like, and basically what that meant was you were taking the requests, you were taking questions from the audience. And the phone op was situated in the phone pit, which was essentially a windowless room right outside the studio. Yeah. And then again, I think timing has always been sort of like my calling card. At the time, it was just sort of the beginning of the internet. So you couldn't Google answers. You couldn't so I was like a pop culture junkie as a little kid. So I knew who was like the fourth lead in a movie. I knew who wrote a song. I knew all these little factoids. And so as they were doing the show and they were doing live morning shows, they would look at each other like, "Hey, do you know who that is?" And I would always kind of know who they're talking about. And eventually, after like a month or two in the phone op room, they said, you guys stay in the studio with us. So I essentially then from that moment on stood in between Scott and Todd for the next 23 years. Like, I would stand in between the two of them that was like my situation. Like, I never sat. I just stood in between the two of them, either shouting out like an answer or writing it down for them, coming up with a joke and writing it down a punchline and handing it to one of the hosts. So it was just incredibly fortunate that they needed to have someone fill that hole of like the young, quirky kid who just had a lot of energy but had a lot of knowledge, and they just saw that as an asset at the time. Again, there was no internet, no social media that they could go to and be like, "Oh, what is that answer?" Like, no, they needed a human to be able to bring that, and that's sort of how my career started.
Well, some of the best producers out there are the ones that can fill the gaps, and the ones that are intuitive to know and understand. Because those guys, listen, for them to get up, like 2, 3 in the morning to go and do a show at 5 or 6 in the morning, and also, being older, they're not going to be in the know of everything. That's that they have to rely on you to go ahead and be the one that's like absorbing all the pop culture, absorbing all the content that the audience is going to go ahead and be listening to. So you got to fill in that gap. And that's what's important. I think it's a missing art for that now. Because I don't think you get a lot of hosts that are able to go and do that. Because even now when I listen to morning shows today, I don't listen to much anymore. I'll listen. For me, being a radio fan for all my life, I barely even touch the AM/FM dial. It's a shame to go to that, but even if I try to go to morning shows now, if I even want to go listen through the commercials, which is gargantuan at best, it's the point is like, I don't feel like I'm moving forward. And I it's like you want to be in the audience, you want to go and reach back out. Like you're answering the answer that somebody else probably on the radio is probably yelling in their car as it's happening to kind of fill in like, okay, move the conversation going, tell them what the answer is. And they can go forward. And it's these, you feel smart about it because you had somebody that's going there. And that nucleus of the producer right there and what you're able to go and do to kind of move the show forward, so important and so crucial.
Yeah, no, and the great thing about it, too, and I think the reason I was able to succeed is even though I'm confident and have an ego just like anybody, I didn't really feel like I needed the accolades or the adoration from the fan base or anything like that to get me going. To me, I got the instant gratification of knowing that, oh, shoot, like the hosts were in a bind and I helped them out. And and to them, I was like a security blanket. I went from being locked into a little foam pit to like never being able to go anywhere without them because they like the idea of me being in the room. Like, I know you've done a lot of board hopping in your career. Like board hop is usually when there's a remote, there's someone back in the studio hitting all the buttons. And when I first started with the team, I was doing the board hopping, but after a while they're like, no. You need to come on site with us. We need your energy. We need your information. We need all that there. So it was one of those things where I used my skill set to sort of shine through and become successful. And then from that point forward, my role just started growing. It started like, I think my title was like associate producer, but eventually elevated to executive producer, which I had that title for 15 years. That was EPing the morning show, which it was a remarkable run. But then it all came to an end in 2019 when our radio station Cumulus Media sold us to a Christian broadcasting company. So in essence, I was fired by Jesus and then just started my next career full-time in podcasting.
K-Love. Yeah. What a crazy thing. But now when it comes down to it, you were doing it in the morning show environment. And I just want to get also the fact that it wasn't your part of what the music format really was because there wasn't much music being played during that time slot. But like the thing was, you were just into the morning show format. It was more of just like you wanted to be in that realm of radio, not necessarily in anything else. You never wanted to spread into becoming a jock. And, was there anything you took away from many of the other folks that you got to work with within that building? Because, or at least from the people that Scott Shannon knew in his purview, because the one thing I would think of is that he procured so much talent. And I think Hollywood Hamilton still works out there today. Wendy Williams still works out there, and what was out there for so many years, unfortunately, with all her things, but had a lengthy radio career before getting to television. And that's the thing, is like there was just so much talent that came through. And what was it about you deciding to go and just stay in that role? And what kept it ambitious, kept it fresh, kept it interesting the whole time through?
Well, first and foremost, you mentioned earlier about the fact that New York, the pay in New York was good. Yeah. And so the idea of and you kind of mentioned it earlier too, as well. Like I started at number one. So for me to have to, I would have to left the market altogether to go find an opportunity and start from scratch, essentially in a smaller market. And to me, I was born and raised in the New York City area. I was born like 10 miles from Manhattan, lived within 10 miles of Manhattan my entire life. So the idea of leaving was never on my mind. But I will say the reason I did stay was not just because the pay and obviously geography. It was really because I loved the job. Like it was amazing to be able to, again, starting in a world pre-internet where if I had an idea for something and I wanted to share it with an audience, I just crack a mic and I do it. You know what I mean? So the ability to create content before the internet age and in a way, and so that it's always funny too, because like when, I don't know if you get this, when you buy a service or something, they'll say, hey, write a Google review. I'm like, I don't write reviews for anything. Because my entire life was always like, if I had something to say about something, I'd just say it on the air.
Right.
So to this day, it's like I rarely ever write a review for anything. It's just because it's always been not something I normally did. When I had something to say, I would just say it on the radio. So I think that part of it, having the creativity and the openness, like even though we were in New York, essentially between 6 and 10, it was our ball game. Like we can do whatever we want. Like if I woke up that morning and had an idea for a parody song, Todd and I would go into his office, bang out a song. Like we would start writing a song at like 5 o'clock. And then within like 45 minutes, it'd be written, recorded, and produced. And just that the ability to do that was just like, there was such a high from that, like the pressure, like, oh man, we got to get this done before 6 o'clock. And so that was sort of like my drug. I was never into drugs.
Yeah.
My drug was like that live radio aspect of, whatever you say, it goes out. There's no take backs. Scott had this line that he always used, that he said that, you have to be like a goalie in hockey. You can't, once the puck goes in the net, you can't take it out. It is what it is. So embracing that, of just really enjoying and living in that moment, and just like being or surrounded by super talented people that could help bring my ideas to life. It was too good to give up at any point during my career.
I want to ask you now, when it comes to when you branch out of radio into other media, the one thing I've always noticed that if you look at, various talent that's on television, if you need a master of ceremonies, you need somebody to host a game show, you need to host a reality show, whatever there are still people that are in radio that continue today that are thriving in television. You think of Steve Harvey, has his run in radio. Ryan Seacrest has had his long run in radio. And I think of so many other talents going back, forever, that were game show hosts that all got their breaks in radio. That was always a great recruitment tool and always a great place to really break open talent so that you could do just about anything. But I don't think the people that, unfortunately, there's a lot of corporations now that own stations. And now, of course, I don't even know, they're not even radio people anymore. They don't necessarily operate from an advantage point where, they really don't want to do anything more creative or help, use radio as the tool it can be right now to create new talent and to create great programming. They don't want to do it anymore. So they've suffocated all that out. But there used to be a place where if you wanted to find great talent, you could start in radio and take them into other channels. And that's why people like yourself, from the background you got in the radio, that's where you're able to go and thrive in podcasting or into various areas you've wanted to do in media. What is it about the experience of being in radio itself and how it challenges you to be able to go and branch yourself off and be able to be adaptable to any other media?
Yeah, I think the ability to communicate without pictures and video and drawings, any kind of
the mind, right?
It's all in your mind, and being able to execute that. It's a talent that is something that you really kind of have to refine. You just don't wake up being able to do that. So it takes years to master. And you mentioned it, like there are a lot of people like that. You also like Pat Sajak started in radio. Oh, yeah. Parlayed that into a 50-year career.
Just passed away, was a radio guy before. You think of I think of like Alex Trebek actually started in radio, and I think Bob Barker actually started in radio. It was just all these people that got all their bones from that. And actually, when I think about with Todd Pettengill, it was like partly was radio and television. He worked in WWF. It's like he also was able to work on the on camera role. There's that point where you're adaptable. You're able to go and just move to some of the web.
Jorge, it's funny. I don't think it happens the other way around, because you probably know this as well as I do. When you see people who are either non-radio people, whether they were in television or music, try to make the jump to radio, they fail all the time. Right. Whoopi Goldberg is a prime example of this. She has an EGOT, like she has an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony. And when she went to do morning radio in New York City, she failed. Famously, David Lee Roth.
Oh, David Lee Roth. Oh, my God, that was a mistake.
David Lee Roth, if people don't remember, when Howard Stern jumped from terrestrial to satellite, they chose David Lee Roth to take over for him, and it was a disaster, an unmitigated disaster. So I think you're right. I think the people who are able to refine their talents on radio can work in any medium. I've always felt like radio was, especially for me in the way I worked, like networking has always been a big part of my career. And when you're in radio, you can network easily with other mediums without any fear of jealousy. Because I think if you see like someone trying to jump from TV to film, like, oh, who the hell are you to try to do film? But like with radio, no one's offended by it. They're like, oh, okay. So I've worked with people in film. I work with people in television. I work with people in print. And so I think it's always been one of those friendly mediums where people got to know who you are. And, you've probably heard this before. Yeah. It's the most intimate medium that's ever been created. People are listening out. They're locked in their cars, doing chores around their house. It's a very private, direct, and it's something you kind of have to do actively. Yeah. Whereas I think a lot of the other mediums are pretty passive. Like you can have the TV on and do 7 different things. You could have a movie on and do like your homework or do like, or write a book while you're watching a movie. With radio, you have to be 100% engaged to really get it, because if you're not paying attention, you're like, wait, what was that? what did that person say? So it is one of those things where it's intimate, but it's also a very active medium that kind of forces people to really be locked in. And the same goes for the people doing it. Like, if you're on TV and, the camera's not on you, you could pretty much you could have a sandwich while the camera's on you. Yeah. In radio, you have to be ready for anything at all times. So no, I think it's a great example. And I remember many, many years ago, you brought up the example of, creating the next generation of radio stars. And it was like 10 or 15 years ago, someone said, who's the next big radio star? Because at the time it was essentially like the Elvis Durans, Ryan Seacrest. So it was all people getting up in age, late 30s, 40s, 50s. Mm-hmm. And I said, they're already here. They're just on YouTube. Like the people that are YouTube stars in the 2000s, 2020s, if it was rewind the clock 40 years, those people probably would be morning radio hosts. Yeah. They would probably be, or a TV talk show host. I think that's just the evolution of technology. And so when we were growing up, it was either be on the radio or be on television. Right. Nowadays, it's like be on radio, maybe on television, not so important, but social media, TikTok, YouTube, it's all there for them.
Now, we have to make mention of the fact that one of those people we didn't make mention of that made the transition from radio to television, Howard Stern going to America's Got Talent. And, if the money was still there, he probably will still do it. But either which way, or he could have always gone to a TV talk show format and do an interview format for himself, which I wish he would have done 10 years ago instead of staying serious. But either which way.
Well, I think that's Howard's one drawback, that he was never able to pull off the transition of a radio show to a TV show. And it's just because of, I think that the medium is really hard to translate from one to the other because of the, think about podcasting, how you could have a 30 to a 2 hour podcast. You can't do that in television. You can't have and you if you ever hear the late night talk show hosts, they say their one brother of doing interviews on their show is I only have 6 minutes with Tom Cruise, whereas a podcast host will have 60 minutes with Tom Cruise.
Right.
I think Howard, it was really tough for him. He tried a lot. There was several attempts for him to make the jump and just wasn't able to pull off the radio to TV. He was able to succeed being a TV personality, like I said, America's Got Talent, but he was never able to make that jump. And I think just because they're just too different, and just people don't watch TV like they consume radio.
But what he did do, which is, I'm going to still give him credit for this, whoever his team was, they're responsible for the YouTube podcast format. More or less, he's one of the types of podcasting setups that we see today. Yeah. Because everybody has a microphone in front of them on a lot of YouTube shows because of Howard. He's the first one that had on the E! Channel to do that. And one of the things you make mention of most recently is a story that you put out in your Good Listen letter about how if you're not on YouTube doing your podcast, you're doing something wrong. That you really need to be out there, prominent video content. And it's not even much so that people are watching the video, it's that people are just watching it on YouTube because that's the platform to go. Yeah. One of the areas is that you were in a variation of that because after Howard went away and moved to Sirius, and then you don't really see, everything was behind a paywall for his content, there was still that kind of room of getting inside the radio studio and watching things as happen. So you were a part of the initial start of the Dish Nation series, which ran for several seasons, syndicated. And it's the same idea. But the idea was that you had several different morning shows, several different markets, and then they were just going through the gossip of whatever the stories that they were. And that's something you did with, and it was with Todd when he was doing the show, and I forget who was co-host was at the time.
Yeah, it was and Todd were both on that show. Oh, they were
still there. Okay, got it.
And it's funny, too, because I think that looking back at it now, and now that we have context for it, I feel like Dish Nation was essentially TikTok. It was a scrolling content wheel of here's what these DJs say in New York. Oh, here's what they say in Atlanta. Oh, here's what they say in Dallas. Here's what they say in Detroit. So it was very fast paced. It was not long segments. It was just really bite-sized pieces of information that was used into a TV show. And I did that show for a year plus. It was a blast, but that was one of those things where it was out of our control. We had a production team that would say, hey, do these stories. We would do them. And then we'd be like, okay, I don't know if you're going to use any of that tonight, but we'll see. And then we turn on the TV. It was on 7:00 local time in New York. And then we'd pop it on and it's like, oh, okay. That's what they chose, or that's what they didn't choose. But going back to your point about the video YouTube, as me being an old school radio guy, I resisted for the longest time integrating video into podcasts. And, you mentioned I worked for Advantage Forbes Books, a publishing company in Charleston, South Carolina, where we produce content for entrepreneurs. And when I first started, I was like, the questions came up, oh, should we do video? I'm like, no, audio only. And part of it was the barrier of entry. When you're doing a video podcast, and especially if you're like an entrepreneur trying to build your thought leadership, the last thing you want to do is like look like you're doing a podcast from your parents' basement with like terrible lighting and the sound looks bad, and you've got like a picture of like a horse behind you. Like there's more to getting it right with video than audio. And I've always been, well, I haven't always been, but I'm really good at editing audio. So, and I've jokingly said to anyone, I can make anybody sound good with audio. Video, it's a lot harder. But as time went on, so
COVID changed it all. COVID actually was the barrier that said, it's okay, it's acceptable to go and see bookcases or to see whatever you want behind the backdrop and however you set up, as long as you have a good microphone. Because the most important thing that people learned after that fact was they needed good equipment. So everybody learned to get better equipment.
Part of it, Jorge, was the performative aspect of it.
Yes.
Because when you're doing an audio podcast, you could be looking down, you could be reading. You can't do that on a video podcast. So that's why, and I was starting with a lot of people that were just starting their sort of like thought leadership journey. So they didn't have TED Talks. They didn't do speeches regularly. So I did it more as to protect them from having to worry about being performative and, reading scripts, reading questions, looking at a camera while they speak. That is the hardest part for, I think, a lot of people to grasp. More and more people getting used to it. You're right. COVID was a big driver for that. But even then, you just don't want to do a video podcast just for the sake of doing it if you're not going to do it well. So that's why I was always resident about it. But as I saw the data come in, and you've seen it, anyone watching or listening has seen this, I think YouTube has now become the number one podcast finding source on the planet. People are finding more and more podcasts on YouTube. YouTube is the third most used search engine in the world after Amazon and Google. So if you're not on there, you're limiting your searchability. So all of the data that comes into play, I think was the thing that really pushed me over the edge. And I saw like, hey, listen, it's now or never, because you have to take advantage while you can and build up that bank of video content that's going to live on the interwebs forever.
And there's a story you put out and saw through your LinkedIn page about changing stations and why channel changing is a liberating act in today's society and diverse media world, you said. And one of the things you talk about is no longer being needed to be forced into watching or listening to things we don't want. That media content creators of all kind have a point of view. We can choose which views work for us, where we want to go. But we did come from radio. I will say this. I know I never got the career that you had in radio. But then again, it was the entry to get in there and to be in the right place at the right time and know who the right connections are. That's really how radio operates. So the freedom here of podcasting was what I really got to embrace. And it's going to be 20 years in August. I'll have said to be able to do that. So at least what I've taken from radio all these years into corporate into podcasting has been wonderful. But one of the things I'm sure you might have had too was a bit of a resistance because, like you said, you want to do audio only. You were always a little bit hesitant to do video right away. And the same thing goes now. Like even for me, I know that YouTube, you have to make your content. I'm not doing it. I'm not myself on my camera doing the YouTube content, but I have the YouTube content up. I just put up, transcriptions, whatever. So like you can see the subtitles going on and I have some kind of decent background. So at least it's something there to watch, but I want to still keep it audio for me. But for others, video is imperative. I want to just get your take on the transition and saying, well, we got to finally do something with video here. And the thing was like the transition from radio to podcasting. Let me just tell this quick story. So when Don and Mike were still on the air and they were syndicated, and it was right after Anna Nicole Smith died, like the same day. I remember calling into that show, and they used to always ask about who you were, like whatever calls, or they wanted to go and rag on you. Well, they went off after me and they said, "Oh, well, I'm in podcasting." It's like then they told me it was Don that said, well, you're just like, you're no different than working in a McDonald's drive-thru, bro. It was like, that was it. They just shot me down. I was like, all right, 2009, I think it was 2008. And now today it's like, well, they're in podcasting themselves if they're not. Well, I think Mike is still, but still they had to embrace the fact that there was a change in what this digital disruption, what the internet's been able to allow us to do. And then moving past the resistance of being able to go ahead and say, well, we got to take this format. We got to make it work.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I will say about that, the digital disruption is I think radio went through it, 20 something years ago, and now television is going through it. It happens with every medium. It happened with print journalism 20 years ago. So I think it's part of surviving in media is being able to adapt. And I think you saw the people that were able to adapt, whether it's even people who are still in terrestrial, like Elvis Duran, who we've mentioned, like all his content is online. Like you don't have to listen to it. I mean, which is what I think one of the cool and bad things about when I was on radio, it was one of those things where like, if you had an amazing moment and it went viral back then was a lot of people heard it and then told someone else, but they wouldn't be able to watch it or see it again. Yeah. Nowadays, if you do a radio show, whether it's terrestrial or podcasting, it's going to live out there, easily accessible for people to find. So yeah, and I will tell you, like, I think like many new technologies, and if you're from a legacy media, you are kind of like going to squint your eye and be like, yeah, is that a real thing? Like, can you make money off of that? Because, we still live and die by advertising. I mean, it's still, whether you're a technology company or whether you're a legacy media company, you are always going to be beholden to advertising. So at the time when you started podcasting, advertisers were like, what? I mean, as much you could say is like Don and Mike joking about podcasting. That was essentially the attitude in the ad community. Oh yeah, there was like, I'm not gonna advertise what is even a podcast? Like, how do you listen to it? And you remember those early days of podcasting before Wi-Fi enabled phones and 5G enabled phones? You'd have to used to plug in your iPod into your computer so you could access it. This is people who listen to this who are like born after like 1980 are like, what are you even talking about? But like that's the way it was. Yeah. So it's just one of those things where you mentioned Dish Nation, and I remember my boss on that show, his name is Stu Weiss, and one of the things that drove me crazy about doing that show was he was beholden to Twitter. This is when Twitter was popping. Right. So he would essentially pick and choose the content that would go on the show, whatever trending on Twitter. And I said to him, I'm like, man, Stu, what are you doing? Like, you've got to be able to use your gut and feel and figure out what's good for television. He goes, I've been in television my entire life, and I don't want to be a dinosaur. And I said, what do you mean by that? He goes, I've known people in my entire career who would not adapt to the times, and then they became extinct. I'll never be that person. So he saw the importance of like, oh, for me to drive content from this show and choose content, I'm going to have to go to Twitter because that's where the audience is going. So I've always kind of sort of grasped that mindset of like, I don't want to be left behind in any technology. That's sort of like was my impetus for the video podcasting thing, was like, I do not want to be left behind in this. I wasn't a astute video editor, but I became one. I taught myself how to video edit, but at a much later age than most people are learning how to video edit. But it's just one of those things where it's like, I knew that I didn't want to be a dinosaur. I did not want to be left behind. So that's why it was important for me to make that transition to video.
But I think there's something to be said about, you can still incorporate human intuition in your gut feeling and still take the metrics and take the demographics and whatever your audience says. But the thing is, I think there has to be a mix of that. And that's the part where I feel like we're with radio content and with podcasting. Yeah, podcasting can be a wide open space, but radio could still have a purpose. And there's still going to be something where in media, you can create things that you think that the audience wants to watch or hear. And you can still have that. But the problem is now there's just too much reliance on metrics. Do you agree with that at all? Do you think, can there be a middle ground?
I think there's a reliance on metrics, but I think when it comes to when you're talking, say, terrestrial radio, I think it comes down to radio, and one of the reasons why Disney sold our radio station is radio is not a growth industry. You can make money in radio. You're not going to go 1x, 2x, 3x year to year.
Companies can't really make it operate right. If you're a local owner and you find it and you have the money to go and work with, and you could go, I mean, there's a lot of local radio stations that will still thrive really well and they can make their money and advertising is fine. But the other part too is in radio, you got to be able to be entertaining or informative across the entire hour. You just can't do what they do now, where the commercials are just so bad and the content is just so unfulfilling. And then the music, if you're not even like being the tastemaker and putting out what people really want to hear and just putting out the same kind of music because the audience says so, metric testing says so, then you're not going to do anything better. There has to be a human component to it.
Well, the big part of it, and you mentioned the analytics of it, the problem now is that we know too much. Yeah. So when I was growing up in radio, to give people a little lesson, if you don't remember this, ratings were done by a diary system.
Oh, yeah.
What would happen was people would, much like sort of like the Nielsen box, but instead of it being a box that would keep track of who you're listening to, people would actually have to write down that from 6 to 10, they listened to Jorge.
Right.
And then from 10 to 12, I didn't do anything. Oh, and then from 3 to 5, I listened to Jorge's radio station. That's how the old time was. And so you saw a lot of stations become hugely successful because people just from habit would be like, yeah, I listened to them from 6 to 10, and that was it. And they would write, and they would write down, I listened to all 4 hours.
Right.
Then what happened was the shift to PPM, which is the personal people meter, which was basically a pager that people would either carry around in their handbag or on their belt or what have you, and it would keep track of what station they were listening to. There was like an encoded sound in every radio station that they would know. What that did was that provided all this data to program directors that said, oh, you know what PPM's telling me is that less talk, more music is what people want to listen to. Because it just the numbers don't lie. And so what you saw a lot of people do was they went to this idea of like, okay, people want more music than talk, but this is around the time where radio's struggling financially. So they're like, less music, more music, less talk, more commercials. So so radio kind of ate itself. Like they knew what people wanted, but in the same regard, they kind of were just like trying to survive. They knew that like great content and personalities was super important, but at the end of the day, they're just sort of like, one of my running jokes I've always said is like a publicist, their number one job criteria is don't get fired. Like that's it. So if you think about it from, if you were saying whatever job you have in your life right now, if your first thing you think about is don't get fired, don't get fired, don't get fired. Not even think about do a good job. Don't get fired, don't get fired. All of a sudden, all you're doing, every action you take is to make sure that doesn't happen. So radio programmers did what it took. They saw the data, more music, less talk, and it's basically killed the live radio personality that we used to know and love.
And the radio that you worked in before, also the people meter, the PPM actually happened. You were in the entire time you were working at WPLJ. It was PPM. It wasn't diary at all, correct?
No, I was diary. The first few years was diary. Yeah, no.
Oh,
we had the diary system when I started. That's how old I am, Jorge. But we did the diary system, and then we switched over to PPM. Early on in my career, but I did see the huge change. Like you saw stations like ratings just like drop like a hammer,
right?
Because you just didn't see people. Because like I said, people would write down, "Oh, I listened for 4 hours," whereas PPM would be like, "No, you didn't. You listened for 4 minutes." And then that's where the rating would come in.
But I think that's the part where, and that goes for current podcasting climate today, is that Joe Pardavila, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me about all this. And, really, it's been great. So the book, once again, Good Listen, Creating Memorable Conversations in Business and Life. Of course, you have the YouTube page at Joe. And just look on Google for Joe Pardavila, Pardavila. And that's it. We're going for there. Joe, thanks for being on with me. Really appreciate you taking time out.
Thank you, Jorge. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right.